I want to talk about what I call the poisoned root that sits at the base of critical theory. In the book Power in Deliberative Democracy, deliberative democracy is defined as an aspiration that places reasoned discussion at the center of political life. Deliberative democracy is concerned with expanding, with strengthening the qualitative outcome of democracy itself. It's concerned with the process, the actual political process that produces a democratic society. And in this case, it's a rational process. The objection I have to this has to do with the way that reason is being defined, with what is being brought into this process that is accounting for democracy. On page 6 in the introduction, it says there are two ways of interpreting the concept of reasoned discussion. The first one is anchored in the Habermasian model of the ideal speech situation. Rational discourse is organized around norms of respect, truthfulness, mutual justification, and sincerity. So this is considered what they call a type 1 deliberation process. It's rational discourse organized around these principles: norms, respect, truthfulness, justification. However, the emphasis on rational justification has also been questioned, particularly by feminist scholars who find the celebration of gentlemanly rules of discourse as exclusionary towards speech styles that depart from the ideal of legal proceedings and scientific communities. In response, the deliberative theorists put forward a broader definition of reasoned discussion. This is referred to as type 2 deliberation. So we're talking about these two forms of rationality in critical theory in this process of deliberative democracy. This definition of reasoned discussion accepts forms of discourse that function as communicative influence under conditions of conflict. So this other approach to deliberative democracy is based on influencing individuals with acts of communication, essentially. The move towards pluralizing speech styles started in the early 2000s in the book Deliberative Democracy and Beyond. The authors of this book considered storytelling, greetings, humor, and rhetoric to be part of deliberation's repertoire of speech. So we have essentially swapped out rationality, the rational model, the justification model. We have swapped this out for communicative influence, for rhetoric. This seems to be problematic to me. By pluralizing speech styles, the dispassionate, logical, and systematic forms of speech are dislodged as the model of deliberative practice. And that's the question. Is it a good thing to dislodge the logical, the rational models with a form of rhetoric, with a form of persuasion, which could be propaganda, because it's communicative influence? Is it a good idea for democracy to swap out rationality for this model of rhetoric? This model contains playful, colorful, tentative, and soft-spoken ways of language are recognized as valid, if not more persuasive forms of reason giving. Certain advocates for this position advocate for the use of protest, strikes, and occupations when conditions of formal deliberations are stacked against marginalized groups. In both accounts, reason giving takes shape in multivocal and culturally diverse ways, allowing for a pluralistic account of deliberative speech. So both of these still contain a type of pluralism. They're trying to embody the universal nature of society as best they can. But this other approach, this to me is what I think of as the poisoned root that lies at the heart of modern critical theory. Now, I want to be clear that I'm not dogmatic in my position here. I'm not closed-minded to this position trying to explain itself or justify itself or try to show that it is more effective than a rational type model. I'm very open to this type of a discourse, but it seems to me that this is exceedingly problematic. If we get rid of reason, it means we're going to replace it with something else. And in this case, we're told what it's replaced with. It's replaced with rhetoric. If we're replacing reason with rhetoric, then how is it that we navigate opposing forms of rhetoric, opposing values that make use of different forms of rhetoric? It would seem that this model reduces democracy to a position of might makes right. Our propaganda makes right. Because if we've thrown out the rational component, the evidential component, and we are in fact being playful, we are having strikes and protests that are not rational, strikes where we deface public art, we have protests where we spit in police officers' faces. I don't see this as being an intelligent way to proceed that is going to ultimately bring about desired results for our political cause. It does not seem to be functioning according to rationality, but precisely to the method that is being posited here. It is what you would expect the outcome to be if you had forsaken a rational model and decided to adopt a model of rhetoric. You would have clashes of power within the public sphere, because how do you resolve the tension if you can't appeal to reason, if you can't appeal to evidence, and one side is being louder than the other side, is being more propaganda than the other side? Then you're not resolving the issue. There has to be a criteria that allows there to be order. That's a very important distinction to make. There has to be a criteria that allows there to be order. Now, this book recognizes that this is a problem. It says there is a risk that the concept of reason giving becomes so broad that deliberative theory loses its capacity to spot communicative distortions. If reason giving can be anything, then it means nothing. So you see, the problem is seen here. They are seeing that there is a problem that comes to the fore here. And this is exactly right. It's that if reason is just propaganda, rhetoric, then anybody can engage in this act and there's no way to resolve this tension. Further, more importantly, and I think this is really the bottom line for me, the most persuasive point, and that is that if we abandon rationality, which I believe, lie to ourselves in thinking we can do, because the moment we can do it, we lose any rational complaint that we might have. But the far more serious problem is that if we abandon rationality, then we put ourselves in a position where we essentially give up the fact, the criteria, the imperative that authority bears the burden of proof. Authority must justify itself. It does not have the right to impose itself by rhetoric, by propaganda. It does not have the right to do that. It has to give a justification for itself. One of the great contemporary German critical theorists, named Rainer Forst, is a champion of this position. He has put forth the necessity of this notion in complex detail. And even though he endorses this text, I think he would have something very constructive to say about what I'm calling the poisoned root at the base of critical theory. Because democracy, freedom, cannot give up the burden of proof. It has to, the authority bears. Freedom demands that authority justify itself. This is imperative. This is how we protect ourselves from tyranny, because tyranny always tries to operate on the basis of authoritarianism. So to me, this is a poison root that sits at the heart of critical theory. Once we have dismissed reason axiomatically from the outset, once we have dismissed science and evidence from the outset, at the presuppositional level, at the a priori level, we have left ourselves essentially in a state of chaos, and we have left ourselves without the ability to complain, without the ability to demand justification, without the ability to judge, without the ability to discern value. We end up in a place of irrationalism, where my feelings are put against your feelings, and whoever is louder, whoever is more powerful, ultimately wins. Now tell me, is that not what we are seeing unfold in society? Do we not see the poisoned root at the heart of deliberative politics, shattering deliberative politics, and driving individuals into a domain of rhetoric and a domain of propaganda? I don't think we can give up reason at all. I think it's self-negating to try. If we attempt to do it, we'll refute ourselves, because we still want to say that things are not true. We still want to say that something is dangerous or something is false. We're not going to give that up. And if we give up reason, we essentially give up the negative critique. We give up the positive critique. We give up critique in general. This type 2 deliberation would seem to be a negation, a violation, a contradiction of deliberative democracy itself. Deliberative democracy is trying to proceed, as we read in the definition, through a rational reason process. So how can it possibly take upon itself this poisoned root of irrationalism and think it's going to proceed into quality? The last thing I will say is that what else is lost in this process is that reason does not side with the regressive position in history. It is not a position that champions and justifies the regressive position in history. Quite the opposite. It weaves itself, it unfolds itself towards complexity and towards progress. And if that is given up, then the regressive forces in the world, who have already been using these type 2 deliberation processes, they are able to interject themselves into the conversation in a way that is not sincere, in a way that they sabotage the quality of society itself. So we, in a sense, give up our freedom. We give up our power if we give up reason, because we are not able to dislodge and make the complaint to demonstrate the dangers of regressive politics.